that addresses the overall issue of euthanasia. And what you're going to do with your assessments is basically to try and discern on what principle is the person arguing about in order to make their point to justify whether killing someone or not is a good thing. Or is it actually intentionally killing someone or not? Or is the choice of that person that they have independently thought about and said yes to? So what is the framework or the thinking or the moral decision making and the reasoning that led to that outcome? And that's exactly what we're trying to assess in ethics, and the fact that whenever decisions are made, they're made by different types of framework. And of course, I understand all of you watched both the movie Tuesdays with Morrie, and also you had that little piece with the eminent lawyer Lucretia Seals stating her case about why she wanted to die, why she chose to die. And of course, there is a contrast between those two experiences that you saw. Can anyone tell me from Tuesdays with Morrie, what did you think was the overall point of Morrie's life? And what was he trying to express?
Other than that, he said that if you live well, you
You're getting there, absolutely. That is, we're often fixated by that uncertainty of dying, and yet we forget to live. And of course, he was a sociology professor initially by trade. He wanted to teach people about how to live. And ultimately, throughout the time that he was decreasing in mobility, you know, the first time that we saw that there was anything wrong with his body was when he was actually trying to back his car. And of course, he was basically not being able to function with his legs due to this debilitating disorder and terminal disorder called Lou Gehrig's disease. And of course, he realized that he could no longer use his legs. And then ultimately, it spread up his body. I think his quote that he said was, "I'm actually melting like a candle." It's a little bit like a candle when you're actually burning the wick, and of course, you know, he was melting, and so gradually he was losing his capability of being able to do things. Now, one of the first quotes that we heard about him saying in reference to his life was that he said that, of course, you know, when he was, you know, talking about things with Mitch, and of course Mitch was this, you know, high-flying journalist, he was really busy, he had all the time for his job, but probably no time for anything else, including his relationships. And of course, what that first quote came out from Morrie was that, you know, it's like people would always try to, you know, be first, but what's wrong with being second? And I think that had a lot to do with how he approached life. Now, of course, this is the aspect of what we see in all of the rest of his life when he was losing his mobility, was that most people would see that as a diminishment, a decrease. Welcome, everyone. We are just talking about the movies and the video clips that you've watched. Most people would see that as a diminishment, so that when you're not able to do something, your life is less worth living. And of course, that fundamental idea that's often put into society is called utilitarianism. You see, we often think that if you're not good at something, you should be taken off the team. If you're not good at certain things because you're not able to do things, then your life should be cut short in some way, or your career should be cut short because you're no longer able to perform that function. That's utilitarianism in its own way. And of course, he got to that point where he knew what was going to come in many instances. There was that time when they were always having this conversation together on these Tuesdays, which then ended up, because he was the former professor, became sort of a university learning experience again. He said he was going to use his life to be able to, or that final part of his life, to be able to teach others about what life is about. And we remember what he said about the time when, he was completely frail, and of course, Mitch had to hoist him up in one particular way or form. And of course, it was like Mitch was trying to figure out how to do it in the best way, and of course, he was struggling. But at the end of the day, was it so much about carrying out those actions well or not? And then too, when Maury mentioned that, there'll be a time where you're actually going to have to wipe my bum. Now, of course, we have a perception in society that that's embarrassing. But where does that come from? Isn't it a natural part of how we are created? And I think that was what he was trying to get at, in the sense that even though you got to that stage, your life still had value because you were able to teach someone else about life itself. And that, of course, is a real contrast to the thinking that we have with the Lucretia Seals case, where we've actually got this high-flying lawyer. Again, it's all to do with what she actually set out to do, was to actually say to people, well, if you've actually got this situation where I know that I won't be able to do these things anymore, I know that I might not even be able to make a choice at the time of when I'm actually going to die, then why should I carry on with this existence of suffering and pain, but instead to be able to die what we call a dignified death? Now, what you'll cover in ethics is that there are a lot of definitions, and of course, it's a little bit like this is one of the analogies we heard from Tuesdays from Maury. Life is a little bit like a rubber band at times with the decisions that we make. So we sometimes make one decision, we base it on one particular principle. The rubber band gets pulled this way. We base our decisions on another principle. The rubber band gets pulled this way. We base our decisions on another principle. The rubber band gets pulled this way, this way. Where can we find that sweet spot that allows the truth to be known? And that is the framework that we often have to grapple with in ethics. In healthcare ethics, there are those 4 fundamental principles that you may have come across. Now, under the Disabilities Code of Human Rights, and also the rights that is for every healthcare provider, there are 4 principles that allow us to discern whether someone under a situation of health can actually determine and work together with the health professional in allowing themselves to have the best outcomes that are achieved. Of course, one of them is autonomy. The patient has a right to be able to choose what is best for them. That's what autonomy is. It's a little bit like driving a car. I'm driving the car here, and other cars don't influence me in the way that I act, because I know what is best for me. I don't want other people to tell me what is best. That is the principle of autonomy that we often uphold in the structure of our healthcare system. So we've got autonomy in one whole. What do you think might go against that principle? Any ideas? If I can always do whatever I like, I know what's best for me, do we live in a vacuum? Do we live in society without relationships? And I think Maury touched on that as well. We don't. That's exactly right. Sometimes our decisions affect others. Sometimes the decisions of others affect us. We need each other. And that was one of the primary things that Maury wanted to teach others about life too. That dependence is not actually necessarily such a bad thing. Because he was talking about the nature of our own lives, and this is where we come into this aspect of natural law. And of course, natural law is just also another concept about what does it mean when we discover what God's intent for us to be as humans is. How do we live by the way that God created us as humans? That's what natural law is. And so oftentimes natural law comes from our own abilities, but also at the same time, our own worth of being able to be as humans, to rationalize, to reason, and to observe, to see, to judge, and to act. Is that actually congruent with who we are before we make that decision? And that's what, at times, natural law can actually help us with. But going back to that case with the Tuesdays with Maury, when you're talking about dependence, you're actually talking about the fact that it is natural for us to depend on one another. And so he raised that example of, well, I'm in this state now, my bum has to be wiped, I've got to be taken care of from others. That is almost an experience of love. It's in the same way when I was a baby. When I was fully dependent on my mother and my dad to actually feed me. What was wrong with that? And of course he mentioned that quote where we've actually got to, in actual fact, realise that these two poles or these two ends of life are in that sense, in fact, depend on each other so much more during the middle of our lives. And that was what he realised about his life, that his life was never devoid of relationships, even though there were the challenges. I mean, you realise that on the other hand, as much as he was very philosophical about his life, he was still very challenged by his condition. We saw that his wife was having these difficult times grappling with caring for him during the evenings. And of course too, there is also a dependence and learning and growth for the family members at hand. And of course this is where we allow ourselves to figure out, is that something more like what we as Catholics believe as the fundamental principles of who we are and the value of life? Do you think that's more congruent or not? Take a stab. Take a stab at it, yeah. Do you think it's more congruent or not? When you're reflecting on life, or more consistent, that's the other word. What are we then taught as people? Number one, we have human dignity, right? Now, human dignity has to be really, really defined well here, because human dignity can also be defined in a way that is in actual fact the autonomy of that person. So when you've got Lucretia Seals going back to her where she says, you know, I want to die a dignified death. That is a death, in her definition, completely opposite to the human concept of what human dignity truly is. Because she's trying to say that whatever life I'm living now is actually not dignified, and therefore I want the death to be dignified rather than my life. I don't want people to wipe my butt. I don't want people to take care of me simply because I'm going to be a burden to them. Now, does our Catholic tradition say something else? What if we think about the people then, and of course, reading the content of the End of Life Choice Act, and that's what you've got to do with some of that content. It is hard going because there's a lot of conditions by which that can be performed. That is the question of physician or doctor-assisted suicide. We allow that to see whether, in actual fact, there was this instance of her just saying that to actually die is actually better than to carry on. Now we've also got to assess too that there's actually a difference in the way that Maury and Lucretia Seals were going in terms of their intelligence and their cognition. We've actually got this experience where Lucretia had a brain tumour, and so obviously she thought that was going to gravely affect her thinking. Again, it's her lack of ability that she's scared about. that will happen, and therefore that wants and warrants her to want to make that decision for others to kill her. On the other hand, you've got this attitude from Maury, whereas my life is in itself a lesson. My life is in itself something that I can convey to somebody else. Then of course those principles are clearly going to be very different to that pro-choice type of method, this autonomy, if you will, that Lucretia was talking about. And of course this is where we try to figure out the differences in the principles between all of these other concepts versus the Catholic's social teaching. Of course, going back to those healthcare concepts, we've got autonomy, we've got beneficence. So whenever a doctor does something, they've actually got to do it for the benefit of that patient, okay? So if it's known that a medical procedure is not going to benefit that patient, then it shouldn't be done. Now, of course, sometimes what happens? You've got autonomy here. This is what the patient wants. But then from the expertise of the doctor knows, for me doing that, that's actually not going to be beneficial for them, so I'm not going to do it. You might actually stretch this to breaking point. This is the problem with the contemporary issues that we grapple with. The other principle in healthcare, as well as these two, is non-maleficence. That is to actually, first of all, do no harm. Sometimes we've got to know a little bit about the science before we can determine what is beneficial, beneficence, versus what is non-maleficence, which is do no harm. And sometimes, again, there is a little bit of a conflict there. So which way do you go in those decisions? Similarly, we've got that final point about justice, access to this particular service whenever people can actually want it in a way that is fair. So whether you're actually rich or whether you're actually poor, it doesn't depend on whether you're rich or poor to be able to access that service in that healthcare. That's what justice is about. That all of these resources and the availability for these healthcare services are spread all equally, distributed equally. Of course, that's one of those aspects that we actually also teach in Catholic social teaching. But in Catholic social teaching, what do you think we first have to consider when we actually see, judge and act, before we actually make a decision whether these things is right, that so-and-so wants to make a choice about their life, or this treatment should go ahead or not? What do you think we have to consider that maybe these other principles haven't considered? It's probably the most fundamental thing that we forget about. We're all made in the image of God. We're all made with human dignity, and it's not our right to be able to take away life and control life as we see fit. And of course, when we understand what Maury said about the issue with a baby, when you've got a baby, they're completely vulnerable. We were once helpless. We were totally dependent on our mum and dad caring for us and loving us. But that is an inherent need that allows the human dignity of that person to be realised. That they weren't going to just throw you away, they weren't just going to ignore you and, not care for you and not feed you. They were actually going to take care of you simply because when you came out, immediately everyone in your family around you knew that if they subscribed to what the natural order of life is about, that there is a guaranteed worth about your life, no matter what you can do. Babies, we know, do predictable things. So the love that goes towards them is not actually dependent on what they can do or not. That throws utilitarianism out the door. That's why you can see that a choice of what I can do or not is not actually Catholic thinking. It's not Catholic thinking simply because in the times when it doesn't relate to the way that we don't value ourselves, then ultimately that goes against our own beliefs and our teachings. And this is where sometimes we too have this experience of humans as being this vulnerable person that needs growth, that needs care, that needs support, that is a fundamental part of our lives. That is that sense of human dignity that we have, that for whatever we do, we must play to the natural order of who we have been created, from, first of all, in birth, right across the other spectrum to the time that we naturally have our ends in life. And of course, one more thing too, that there is in actual fact a concept of hope. What is there when it comes to the fact that right at the very end of Tuesdays with Maury, you'll notice that there was a conversation, and Mitch became very, very emotional in that conversation. Maury says, I'll see you next Tuesday, okay? It was very obvious that Maury was probably going to go, and we don't know where we're going to go. That was the thing too, that he was talking about that little bird. That little bird, just saying, is my soul going to fly away today? Well, in terms of that little bird, we all don't know when that day is, whether we're actually alive and well and being able to do things, and whether we're actually bed-bound, but then not being able to do anything. We don't really know the time that we are going to go. And that was his point too, that in actual fact, hope is the realization that your life is in actual fact a continuum to eternal life that we've got. That belief that even when we go, we live. And of course that promise of the resurrection, all of those images of Jesus and the cross should then flood back to us. And the fact that Jesus never promised an easy life. Jesus never promised a convenient life. And Jesus at times, on that road to Calvary, was in that situation of vulnerability, needing others to care for him. And so this is how you can actually bring certain aspects of Catholic teaching into this argument against something like euthanasia. And of course too, we've got this aspect of, we've got hope, one of these virtues that allows us to know that life is actually a greater part of a whole, rather than actually saying that death is the end point, and in actual fact, death is something that I can choose. And of course too, one of the newest developments about this end of life choice act is that there have been a couple of what we call amendments to the law. When we say that someone can actually choose their death, and of course, if we were actually going through the law, we're talking about an actual condition, a medical condition, that is in actual fact, considered to make the patient have a life expectancy of less than 6 months. So we know that at this time, the law can only be done onto those people if they are expected to live less than 6 months. And of course, society is actually trying to change that now. They're like, well, hang on a minute, there's terminal illnesses and conditions that, basically are terminal, and yet, that is the time before that 6 month mark where patients are able to make their choice or make their decisions, exercising their autonomy so that they can actually make that decision for that mandate for them to be killed. That is, at times, how we can then change the terms of reference of what that law is about too. Of course, it isn't necessarily from a Catholic social point of teaching a good thing. Of course, when you're actually talking about now, it's not just about the terminal illnesses that are in a 6 month time frame. We're now applying it to for anybody who thinks that they are actually in a terminal illness that cannot be cured. You can actually convince 2 medical practitioners and a psychiatrist that basically what you can do is something that is worthy of consideration. And of course, this is where the danger lies, is the fact that we've now actually got this situation where, because we've championed autonomy so much, that I'm my own person and I know what's best for myself, we've actually got a situation in the Netherlands where a 28-year-old who was suffering from depression, and this was clinical depression, decided that she, under similar circumstances of physician-assisted suicide, take that jump, make that choice and say, I'm actually going to do this simply because I'm living with an incurable condition. It's not to say that mental conditions are not incurable. It's not just having to be able to do things. I'm well in being able to do things, but my mental capacity is at an all-time low, so take me away. You can see how, when we consider one aspect of controlling life with autonomy, it can then ultimately spread to other areas and other contexts, which then the law may change over a period of time. And of course, we then ask that question again, is that consistent with our Catholic value, especially that of human dignity? And I guess this is where, when you actually saw that piece with Lucretia Seals, who then, took the jump and then made that condition of assisted suicide, did you experience any aspect of what she was going through that you may have thought was maybe not so right